Hey, what is going on, you guys? Admiral Tori here, and welcome aboard for another World of Warships video on my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be set sailing with the Tier 7 Japanese heavy cruiser, the Myoko. So I do have a gameplay that is pre-recorded for the Myoko, and I do plan on using that gameplay for this video for the sake of easiness, because it is much more difficult to play through like 20 some games and then pick some of the games that I find interesting while doing a live commentary. So I decided that I just might as well just grind on the Myoko and then just grab one of the gameplays that I find interesting and then post it for this video. So the Myoko, let's talk about the Myoko in terms of her historical significance. Now, the Myoko, for a Japanese ship, she is actually quite interesting because she is the second Japanese ship that I know of that actually survived World War II. Most of the Japanese ships that were fighting during World War II, especially in 1944, were sunk, and the Myoko, being the lead ship of her class of cruiser, was the first of her kind, and she is probably the last that has ever stand for her kind, because her three other sister ship, that I don't recall their exact names, but she had three other sister ship, and I believe the game will tell you, yep, 4 ships in the series, the Myoko being the first, because the first ship that's been set out to sea is usually been called by their own class. So the Myoko class, the Myoko being the original lead ship, was able to survive World War II, especially at the time of 1944. Because in 1944, that was a period when the United States Navy had complete control over the seas, and basically Japan had no way of winning the naval warfare due to the fact that the United States had more aircraft carriers, more manpower when it comes to industry, more men to serve during the war, and overall they were making a lot of mistakes and they started to throw their plans away. And as a result, at the last parts of 1944 and 45 with the Japanese Navy, it was more of a suicide mission rather than a mission to try to regain some dominance, which is pretty much a very low chance. I would say as low as 10%. Like, there's only a 10% chance that Japan could even win against the United States after the Battle of Midway. After the Battle of Midway, it was their greatest mistake, and Japan has lost all of their power on sea, and basically most of their veteran crew members were dead. So what you have left is outnumbered, outgunned. Technology-wise, the United States had a better technology ship throughout the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, especially after Midway, because the Japanese did have some superiority when it comes to battleships and also aircrafts, but after Midway, that all changed. So when it comes to technology, they lost on that fact because the United States was more into their technology at that time, especially with the Iowa class battleships. What else? They were running out of like experienced pilots and everything else about the Japanese Navy. They were just on the losing side, and they were bound to lose. So in 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, this was like the Japanese version of Pearl Harbor, which basically means that not necessarily surprise attack, but completely wipe out the entire Navy, which was the plan for Pearl Harbor, which is why it is referred as a surprise attack. Admiral Yamamoto, he wanted to attack the United States. He knew for a fact that the United States was a better country when it comes to their productions and in terms of their manpower and everything, and the only way is to get the advantage for Japan when they declare war on the United States. So what Admiral Yamamoto did was attack Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor was the largest fleet of American battleships and hopefully the aircraft carriers, which they happened to be not there, so that was one of the drawbacks for an attack on Pearl Harbor. If they were able to sink the carriers, it would have been a different story for Pearl Harbor. But yeah, the Japanese version of Pearl Harbor was at the Battle of Leyte and the Philippine Sea, which is most of the major ships that you know from Japan, like the Yamato class, including the Yamato herself, and the Musashi were involved in 1944, the Shokaku class carriers, the Myoko, the Atago, the Takayo class cruiser, the Mogami, and the Fuso. I think the sister ship of the Nagato also. But a lot of ships that you guys know from the Japanese line were sunk in 1944, and then 45, some of the ships that were still standing, which were converted into an anti-air dock, I guess, like a little anti-air ship, rather than a ship to engage other ships, they were eventually sunk by the United States aircraft carrier for their attack on the mainland of Japan. So yeah, a lot of the Japanese ships, I would say, I don't know the exact details, but most of the ships I read, I want to say at least more than half of the major ships were sunk. and it was surprising to see that the Miyoko was one of the few ships that actually survived. Now, she is not like the Fuso, who is used as a training ship and hasn't seen that much of a purpose during World War II, even though the Fuso is one of the capital ships, one of the big ships, and a ship that could have been used during the war, but they choose not to, the same way as the Yamato. So yeah, the Miyoko is the opposite of the Fuso, but similar in the way that she was able to survive most of the war, even though the Fuso was sunk in 1944. And that's what made the Miyoko an impressive ship. She was able to engage in major battles. If you take a moment to actually Google the Miyoko, the original Miyoko, not her sister ships, because her sister ships were sunk during the engagement, but the Miyoko, she has participated in several battles that I actually recognize, and I would consider major battles because those are the battles that actually allowed the United States to push onto the mainlands of Japan throughout the Pacific theater. And some of these battles, like the Miyoko purpose, was to do offshore bombardment, escort the Shokaku class carriers, and all the amazing things you can find from the cruisers. And cruisers are admittedly one of the most versatile ships during World War II. They weren't as expensive as battleships, they weren't as slow as battleships, but they are much more effective when it comes to guns compared to a destroyer. They were also equipped with torpedo armaments, which make Japanese cruisers very famous on World War ships. Now, in terms of her respectable historical aspect, she could have been a premium ship, but they didn't make it as a premium ship for several reasons. One of the reasons was that they needed a tier 7 type of ship to succeed the Ioba, and they picked the Miyoko instead because the Miyoko was the only ship that can succeed. Unlike the Americans have a lot of ship classes. Like I said, the United States of America just happens to be making a lot of ships, and they were considered a war power at that time, so they were able to allocate enough resources to make all sorts of ships that you don't even see on World War ships yet that are upcoming premiums. So the Miyoko, when it comes to Japanese heavy cruisers, if you're a big fan of Japanese heavy cruisers or heavy cruisers in general, the Miyoko would be considered a good ship. But just because she is a good ship, how does she contest against other competitors like the York, the Pensacola, and the Russian, I don't know how to pronounce the Russian ship, maybe the Russian Score? I don't know my Russian, guys. You guys know me. Even though Russia is a couple miles away from the coast of the United States, I just don't know any Russian. So I think Russian is the hardest name for me to actually pronounce any of the ships. I had to look them up if I ever plan on doing a Russian video. But I'm more fluent with the Japanese and the American and of course the British, because the British were the one who give English to the Americans. But yeah, the Miyoko. So let's talk about the Miyoko in terms of her World Warships aspects and also her quirks, because there are really weird stuff about the Miyoko that really drives me nuts, and I don't understand why. Now, you might be wondering, if you subscribe to my channel long enough, why am I doing a Miyoko and not a Aoba video? Because I haven't done a Aoba video. The Aoba, to me, was pretty much exactly the same as the Furutaka, and also I was having a troublesome time with the Ioba, and I decided that maybe I should just skip the Ioba and get the Miyoko, because the Miyoko is really exactly like the Ioba, but better because she has extra guns compared to the Ioba. One of the drawbacks with the Ioba I had was because of her pretty much lack of numbers of guns, and you're contesting a Cleveland and a Nuremberg. The Nuremberg has a high firepower, also the Buyoni, which is the Russian tier 6 cruiser. So I felt that the Ioba, in my opinion, she was last on the list with a combination of having a slow turret traverse compared to those other cruisers. Those cruisers were more of a DPS type, while the Ioba is really a heavy cruiser. But just because she was last on my list doesn't mean that she's completely ineffective. She is still a heavy cruiser, and being a heavy cruiser allowed her to actually do more damage per shell, which is the key thing that makes Japanese cruisers successful. If you can land your shots, if you're a battleship player like me, if you're all about accuracy, Japanese heavy cruisers are very brutal. And one thing about the Miyoko that I've learned, especially with the Atago experience I have also come along with the Miyoko, is that Japanese heavy cruisers have one of the highest chances of setting battleships on fire. And if you land like at least half your shots, there's a good chance that you're going to set your battleship on fire. And my favorite targets are usually the American battleship because they're slow, they're wide, and they can't really do much against a very thin profile cruiser. Now, granted, these cruisers can be citadel easily, but at the same time, these cruisers do have very solid armor. The only problem why these ships are easily citadels because they have a huge citadel area, like this Miyoko. This Miyoko has 3 guns in the front, a big citadel in the center right here, and a citadel on the back here. So they do have a big citadel area, but overall, the ship is a heavy cruiser, and she can certainly bounce 16-inch shells off of battleships, a bunch of shells from AP from cruisers, and basically she can brawl with other cruisers as long as you angle. But she is also one of the easier ships to actually citadel at the same time. And the combination of being a thin profile, there are drawbacks for being thin, but also pros. Being a pro is that you're harder to hit when you're trying to angle yourself because this ship is pretty thin compared to her competitors. Maybe not the Pensacola. I think the Pensacola might be thinner. Let's check out the Pensacola. I do have the Pensacola. Yeah, the Pensacola is fairly thin, but at the same time, the Miyoko, I think the Miyoko has better armor than Pensacola in my opinion. But at the same time, when you're thin like this, that means there's a higher chance of you actually being citadel by another cruiser. If you're a wide ship like the Tirpitz, even though she is a battleship, is not a good way to put example. But the Tirpitz has similar armor to some of the other battleships, but the Tirpitz is a very wide ship, which is why sometimes it is really weird when you aim at the citadel of a Tirpitz, you don't get that citadel. It's due to the fact that she is a very wide ship. So back to the Miyoko. Where is my Miyoko? Her drawback. Let's talk about her drawbacks. Now, the common drawbacks, I don't want to mention it all the time, but Japanese heavy cruisers or Japanese cruisers in general don't really have that much of an anti-air until like tier 10 or maybe tier 9. And her only real strength when it comes to anti-air is to use her her float plane with the defensive fire. That's the only way you can actually defend yourself against the aircraft carrier. And if you play Japanese ships in general, you should know by then that Japanese anti-air are not that great, even though ironically most of their engagement during World War II period was all about the air power, and they kind of figured that out themselves because Japan had a huge air superiority at that time for having the largest aircraft carrier fleet before the United States took over after the Battle of Midway. So yeah, it's kind of ironic, and most of the anti-air are designed by the French. They took some of the designs from the French when they were studying abroad. Before World War II happened, they were trying to figure out some good anti-air. I think they should have took it from the Swedish, because the United States of America took it from Sweden with the Bofors, I believe, because the Bofors are from Sweden, or maybe Switzerland. No, Sweden. It's gotta be Sweden. It's always a Swedish. I swear it's a Swedish. Correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, the Bofors, if they took it from the Swedish, it could have been a different story. Then that means the Japanese would have somewhat similar to anti-capabilities of the American battleships and the American cruisers. But they didn't. They took it from the French, and I think the French company is Hotch. I think Hotch. What is French? I'm pretty sure the anti-air is designed by the French, or at least they copy from the French. A lot of Japanese design, they tend to copy, but with the Miyoko, after the 1920s, they designed their own type of ship, which is interesting because the Americans and the Japanese and all the other nations were in a race, and the Japanese always tend to take it from the European nations, especially from the British, because the British were the one who helped the Japanese build up their naval power. The British what gave them the knowledge to build the fire control system, built the torpedo armaments, and later on they innovate upon their own ideas, and then they built their own class of cruisers. And the Miyoko is one of the byproducts of what they learned from the British. This is their own type. I think the last capital ship that the Japanese took from the British was really the Kongo class battle cruiser, or the Kongo class fast battleship, if you want to say it that way. So the Miyoko, what is her drawback aside from her anti-air? Another major drawback is that her turret traverse speed does not make sense. Actually, her turrets in general, her guns are nice, okay? Her guns do a lot of damage. Her HE guns do a lot of damage. Her AP, for some odd reason, her AP does a lot of damage, but she can't really penetrate battleship armor that well compared to like German AP, even though I think the Miyoko has a higher damage per hit with the AP shells. And same thing goes with the Pensacola. I think the Pensacola penetrate better than the Miyoko, even though the Pensacola have the same caliber size of gun than the Miyoko. And that's from my experience. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I am, but in most cases, Japanese cruisers, when it comes to their guns, I think HE is the more reliable choice. The only time I use AP is when you engage other AP cruisers or cruisers that are using AP against you, and if they show up broadside, low AP, because AP does a lot of damage against other cruisers. But overall, if a cruiser is angled or you're going against a battleship, always use HE because the percentage of setting a ship on fire is the highest on the Japanese ship, I believe. Next to it might be the Russians, but the worst is the German ships because the Germans usually go with the AP, and the Americans are just in the middle, similar to the Japanese, being slightly in the middle, but the Japanese have better HE overall. So her guns are not the problem, but her turrets. And what is wrong with her turrets? There are two major issues I found with the Myoko. The first major issue is that her turret traverse very slow, and I'm trying to wrap my head around with it because the Aoba has exactly the same design as the Myoko turrets, but the Aoba turrets rotate much faster than the Myoko if I recall correctly. When I unlock the Myoko turret traverse speed is 45 seconds, not 45 standard, 45 seconds as a stock cruiser, and 45 seconds, if I remember, is the turret traverse speed on the Kongo. And the difference between the Kongo and the Myoko is the Kongo is a battleship, and she has 14-inch guns, while the Myoko has, I think, 8-inch guns, or if you want to say it properly, with the artillery, the 203mm guns. So these guns are much smaller, not much faster. Actually, they are faster when it comes to fire rate, but they're much smaller than the Kongo, but yet she rotates as fast as the Kongo. And I wonder why would they do that? Because it's a very pain. It's like a big pain to play the Myoko because of her turret traverse speed. Half the time you won't be on target or have your guns bare to arms. So you gotta have to do what you do with the Warspite and basically pre-aim your turrets before you engage another ship, meaning that you have to have a lot of skill with the minimap. If you look on the minimap, you see the enemy ship is on that side. Make sure your turrets are pointing that side of your ship and make sure you're positioning your Myoko properly. Now, the other problem with the Myoko is also with her turret is that she has a very poor turret angle. And what I mean by that is that in order to get all her guns to bear, you're going to have to show your broadside, a pretty good broadside. Like, she's slightly angled, not like a full broadside, but it doesn't matter because at that angle, you still can penetrate the Myoko's citadel. So the only way to actually work around that problem for me, which I find, and usually I pick on battleships, after playing this much of battleships, I know for a fact that on average, battleships send a salvo 30 seconds. So when they fire their first salvo, make sure you angle, and after their salvo misses you because you are a thin type of cruiser, you show your broadside and bear all your guns, load HE, and shoot 2 salvos, which is the magic number, because in 2 salvos, that should be about 26 seconds, 28 seconds, and then re-angle yourself and only use your rear guns if the battleship chooses to wait for you. Once the battleship fires another salvo, then go for another broadside for 2 more salvos, and eventually you will wither the battleship down to its bare knees or to the bottom of the ocean. And that's really the only way to work around with the Myoko. Now that also addresses with another problem with that kind of tactic. How about cruisers? Well, at least the Myoko has very good armor when it comes to angling and bouncing those AP shells. And if you're going against a cruiser who's using AP against you, stay angled, because it is really not worth it to lose half your health just to bear all your guns. You're better off waiting for the cruiser to give up on his AP and load HE. When the enemy cruiser uses HE, then use your AP, and when the cruiser's showing his broadside with his HE, you can show your broadside against him because HE doesn't really do that much damage against your belt armor, because when it comes to showing broadside, AP is the way to go, but if they load HE, it doesn't really matter, and you're going to be engaging the other cruiser that way. Now, if the cruiser loads back to AP, go back to angling unless you choose to go last second, try to engage, or take your chances of killing the cruiser before he citadels you, because the Myoko does have a big citadel, like I said. Aside from that, I think really her guns in terms of her turret traverse speed and her angling is the biggest problem with the Myoko. I would certainly rate the Myoko one of my favorite cruisers to play, but I still plan on selling her because I do have one of the Arpeggio ship, which is a Myoko. That Arpeggio ship is basically the same thing as this ship, but it has the anime type of style, and I don't see the needs of keeping the Myoko. And also, I'm about to lock in Mogami, so I'm going to need some cash to get that Mogami. So I might as well sell the Myoko, because Myoko is taking up port slot, and also I can really use the money to unlock the Mogami, which is a ship that I do not have. So yeah, Myoko, overall, I would say that she is a solid cruiser. Where would I put her? With my limited experience with the Pensacola and the Miyoko, I don't have the York nor the Shore. I don't know the Russian name. I do apologize. I think the Miyoko is so far my most favorite ship. For the past several games, I had like a 60 to 80% win rate with the Miyoko, which is kind of surprising with an average damage of almost 100k, almost like 80 to 100k if I'm having a good game or a decent game. I usually pull off at least 50k for this decent game, 80 to 100k with just HE. I mean, the fire damage is really good on the Miyoko. So aside from that, let's get into the gameplay and see how the Miyoko performs. Alrighty guys, we are in the match. Let's set sail with the tier 7 Japanese heavy cruiser, the Miyoko, full steam ahead into a map that I don't recall the name. Even though I played this map several times, sometimes I just don't recall names because lately wargaming for the patches are coming out almost every month, and that's great, but there's a lot of maps also comes around with them, and sometimes I feel that the maps are similar in some sense. Maybe they changed the islands a little bit, or changed the theme, changed the location. What else? That the storm in certain maps. I think the storm actually occurs in most maps nowadays. Not sure, but the storm is like a low chance of happening on certain maps, but I think all maps have the capabilities, except the lower tier maps, of course. Mainly the higher tiers like tier 7, 8, 9, and 10, where the storm can possibly occur. Depending on the map, like Islands of Ice, you get the blizzard. This map, you probably get the raining storm, the rainstorm, the thunderstorm. I think that is the right word I'm looking for, the thunderstorm. So yeah, this is, I don't know what map it is, but I can tell you certainly that we're playing a match of standard battle. And when it comes to standard battle, it's something that I don't really enjoy playing in World of Warships. Sometimes I do enjoy standard battle because it offers some strategy and something different from domination, aside from just going in, capture flag, and killing people. There is some strategy, but this is a solo type of game. Whenever you play a random battle, things don't go the way you want them to go as usual when it comes to the real world of the internet. So I am sailing, and I noticed that I got spotted, meaning that there is a good chance a DD is nearby, or a destroyer if you don't know what DD means. But a destroyer is certainly near my vicinity of my spotting range, and I can tell that for certain because Japanese heavy cruisers have very good concealment, and there's only one other ship that can really outclass that concealment, and that is destroyer, or another Japanese heavy cruiser that happens to have better concealment, like the Atago, which has like 10 kilometers, while the Miyoko has 13 kilometers, even though the Miyoko is bigger than the Atago, maybe because of premium reasons. But I can tell you certainly there is a destroyer nearby, and you can tell when you pass through the islands. If you pass through the island and you suddenly don't get spotted anymore, that tells you that the destroyer is in that perpendicular direction of your broadside. If you're sailing broadside against that island, okay? And that kind of gives me a good idea, a good guess, a prediction that there's a destroyer over there. I gotta keep that in mind. And when it comes to playing World of Warship, it's always a good idea to have some map knowledge and also some surrounding instincts that there's going to be a danger right around that corner. And this map is very infamous when it comes to destroyers because look at the amount of mountains and islands that it offers for cover. So I did spot 2 cruisers, and in my Sony Vegas preview, which is what I'm watching off of while I'm commentate, sometimes the text, the quality is not that great because I'm trying to run this as low as possible to get the best frame rate. I don't have a supercomputer that NASA offers me. I wish NASA sponsored me and gave me a free supercomputer to preview all my videos, but unfortunately I'm running on a regular people's PC. So sometimes it's laggy, sometimes I can't tell what ship I'm facing, but I can tell you certainly that is a York, I believe, and a Cleveland. So I'm switching to HE after following with the AP onto the York, which I also got 2 citadels, which is something amazing to get off of a Japanese cruiser. That HE, that one round of HE, just HE, not AP, hit that Cleveland for a quarter of itself. That tells you how powerful Japanese HEs are. Now switch back to AP because I was looking on the minimap, and judging from the minimap, before he comes around the island, he was still showing a broadside. Unfortunately, even though he was still showing a broadside, he does not get a citadel from me. So I switched back to HE because he's actually angling. Now, like I said, I personally prefer using HE on Japanese cruisers. American cruisers, I tend to switch around with HE and AP. I start with AP with American cruisers just because they are much more punchier than Japanese, in my my opinion, except if you play the tier 10 Zao. I've seen the Zaos with their AP, they're really powerful. They're almost like battleship level AP. But in most cases, I always stick with the HE, with the Japanese. And if they show a broadside, if I feel like they're going to show the broadside for a long periods of time, then that's the good time to switch to AP. German cruisers, I test AP always AP first, and then if they're angled, then switch to HE, because I think German cruisers have the lowest chance of setting something on fire, and they also have very low alpha damage when it comes to HE, I believe, the last time I played German cruisers. So I always go for AP whenever I have the opportunity with the Japanese Myoko, but in most cases, if the target, it's a little judgment, you know. Sometimes when you watch the player plays their ship, you kind of get an idea of how they play. You just take the first 10 seconds, like the pretty much 10 to 15 seconds, depending on the ship. If they tend to wiggle around a lot, then that means you want to use HE, because most likely, you're not going to hit that citadel because they're a tough target, number one, and most likely you're going to be angled because they're wiggling a lot. Now, sometimes you face players who show broadside just to fire the AP, and that means you probably want to switch to AP if you want to take your chances and wait for the player to take that moment to fire the broadside, because you know for a fact that that player is going to show that broadside for a split second, and there's a good chance you can get a citadel. Now, there's some players like me who likes to not show a broadside at all and just use the front guns or use the rear guns. That's mainly when you want to switch to HE, because you're better off doing superstructure damage rather than your broadside damage on the enemy ship, because it's not going to be showing your broadside, it's going to be bouncing your AP shells at all times. So it's a good idea. It's one of these things that you learn when you play World of Warship throughout your times, that a ship tend to have some kind of behavior, and it is your judgment as a captain to judge which shell you should use depending on the enemy's behavior. Now, I noticed that Arizona, I tried to set them on fire because, like I said, I love using HE against battleship with a Japanese heavy cruiser, especially when you have demolition expert, because you can set a ton of fire and do a lot of damage. And one thing about American battleships, if you play American battleship, especially the Arizona, she has very slow traverse speed in terms of her turrets. She is a slow ship, which is easier to hit, meaning that most of the time when I'm looking at the Arizona, she is not pointing her guns at me. And that is when you take the opportunity to capitalize on your mainstream damage, which is showing your broadside and following up with all your guns. And like I said, one of the drawbacks with the Myoko is that you have to show your broadside in order to bear all your guns. But when you take your knowledge that the enemy is not showing his guns at you, and this is a battleship, we're talking about 14-inch guns off the Arizona, not pointing her guns at you, that lowers the chance of actually getting citadel on her, and she is focusing on another ship, you should take that opportunity to set her on fire as much as you can, or most likely do as much damage at the same time, because the HE is not just for fire. It can do a devastating amount of damage. You can knock out the AA for aircraft carriers in your game. It can knock out some secondaries. HE in general is just really powerful. I know I'm repeating myself with this like a broken recorder, but I can't stress it enough. But like I said, AP is still a viable option. Mainly against cruisers. I don't really recommend going against battleships unless you want to take your chances. There are just some ships I play that AP, even if they have the same caliber, I mentioned this in earlier parts of my video, that even though they have the same caliber, some of the ships have better chance of penetrating other ships' citadel when it comes to battleships, even though you have the same caliber size. So here we go, we got York coming around the island, showing his broadside, get a double citadel. I noticed that, and I started to slow down, I believe, right around now, because I want to take the opportunity to get as much shots as I can before the York realizes that I'm firing on his broadside. Now, you don't want to go full speed all the time. I'm not sure why, but some players tend to go like full speed all the time. They think that it is the best option. Sometimes you want to come to a complete stop and then wait until the enemy reacts, and that's when you want to go full speed ahead to change your position. Now in this case, this York failed to react to my attack, and he finally turned his guns, but it was too late for him to even react to it, so he dies to my AP shells. AP, best when it is under 10 kilometers, like I said. So especially back to HE, sometimes when you engage cruisers at like past 10 kilometers and you have AP loaded and they're showing a broadside, it sounds like a good idea to use AP. There's some exceptions. Sometimes I feel like the AP doesn't really penetrate well even though the enemy is showing broadside at a long distance. So I still stick with the HE. And at the same time, when you're playing a tier 7 ship, you expect players to be more smarter than the lower tiers, because the lower tiers, people just start to play, they start to understand the citadels, they start to understand how to become a harder target. But in the higher tiers, people know what they're doing, most likely, hopefully. Sometimes you get those really offset games that people don't have a sense of clue what is going on, and they like to chicken around the objective and chicken around the enemy. So I noticed that looking at the minimap, it looks like most of this side of the map is pretty much done. And the great thing about Japanese cruisers, that I find that they're pretty fast cruisers, even though they are a big ship in terms of their length. Now, I'm assuming the reason why Japanese ships are fast is because they are very thin in profile, which I talked about earlier in my video. And I noticed this Fujin right here. He got so unlucky when I spotted him. The moment I spotted him, he knows he was so screwed, and he popped that smoke right away. Now, I know for a fact that Fujin maybe dropped his torpedoes, but most likely not, because he was pointing his bow at me. But there's a good chance that there's torpedoes in the water, and I think those torpedoes were trying to hit that battleship right in front of me, but I can see what that battleship is. I'm literally watching this like in 480p. I can't tell what it is. That is the Colorado. I almost called it a Tirpitz for a second. I'm not sure why. So I noticed that the enemy is on the other side. We just pretty much wiped out the east side, and those two cruisers on the north end of the map, I believe. Is that the north? Well, I think that's the west. Maybe north. But basically, the upper half of the map, those two cruisers are chasing that one last battleship that, if I recall correctly, that's probably a Fuso. So the best choice to do is that with the Japanese mobility for being a fast cruiser, especially for being a heavy cruiser at the same time, I'm going to take the opportunity to sail across the map and try to finish off the enemy on the other side. And it is always good as a cruiser player, because cruisers are one of the most versatile ships to play in this game, because they're equally fast as a destroyer sometimes. They have somewhat a really good armor compared to a battleship or maybe battle cruiser, and they have powerful armament, not as big as battleships, but still do a lot, like tons of damage, like just ridiculous amount of damage if you're really on your shots. So I decided to switch my focus to the other side of the map, and what do you know? Another destroyer magically popped out of nowhere. Unfortunately, he's not gonna get out of this situation for sure. And there goes that Musuki. So like I said, it's cool when you have this nice concealment with the Japanese heavy cruisers, because the moment you get spotted, there is like a 4 kilometers, I guess. If you can sail 4 kilometers toward a destroyer in time, which is why I run the acceleration module for my ship, because I want to pick up speed as fast as possible. You can engage a destroyer within a couple seconds, because the destroyer probably don't have enough time to actually rotate his entire ship for a U-turn, and by the time he does his U-turn, I'll probably caught up by him and spot him, because I have a very low concealment for a Japanese heavy cruiser. Don't have that much time to react all of a sudden when they spot me. So basically, I can catch them on the spot. Now, although I can catch Japanese destroyers, American destroyers, and all those destroyers I meet, there are some drawbacks for playing heavy cruisers. I personally prefer light cruisers over heavy cruisers when it comes to dealing with destroyers, because the light cruisers have a higher fire rate. Now, although they don't do as much damage per shell, they can actually put more pressure on destroyers, because destroyers have to wiggle a lot, and also with having a lot of shells going that range, you can destroy much more modules than these heavy cruisers can do. And with the Myoko, you have to show your broadside to fire all your guns, so it's pretty difficult to kill destroyers when they're far away with the Myoko, even though you're a heavy cruiser which has a high velocity shell coming at them. So I switched my focus to, I think that's is that the Texas? No, that's the New York. And I also bagged myself that marble head. Let's look at this New York. New York is going to try to struggle his way away from my team. He's firing his guns at me, but his guns are not that accurate. Now, keeping in mind, battleships, especially with the New York, it takes about 30-some seconds to reload. So I'm going to try to get at least 2 salvos, or maybe 3 if I'm pushing my luck on this, to set him on fire. And he's showing that very nice broadside. Now, he's sailing towards me, so I'm kind of like aiming a little bit lower, but not on the waterline, because I'm not running AP. You want to have your shells land on top of the superstructure on the decks. That's where you do the damage. That's how you properly use HE. Now, the New York switches his focus onto that destroyer, which is low health, because he wants to bag a kill before the game ends. So I'm going to show my broadside and push my luck by shooting as much as I can onto that New York. Now, New York is turning, and I noticed that, is that a Cleveland or one of the cruisers around that corner? But the New York is focusing the destroyer, so I'm going to try to bag this New York as fast as possible because he is a capital ship. Aircraft carriers and battleships are considered capital ships because they're big ships, they take a while to kill, and they can really change the game if they are really well played. So I want to get rid of this New York as fast as possible, even though we're technically winning. My shells do happen to land on top of the ship, so you notice that when my shells land on top of the ship, I do a lot of damage. Now, I don't know who just shot at me. Was that the New York who actually hit my broadside? But somebody actually got a Citadel on me. Not a big deal, because I'm actually doing well. I don't mind getting Citadel since I already got what I wanted. 130 some thousand damage would certainly give me a lot of XP and a lot of coins in the process. So I don't mind putting myself into a position where I'm going to sacrifice myself to do as much damage before I die, or put myself in a poor situation since we're pretty much guaranteed to win. Now this is a... what's that? Is that another New York? Maybe that was not a cruiser. I was mistaken. I thought that was a cruiser. Yeah, that is another New York. So this is the New York that could have got me a Kraken. Now I'm going to try to kill this New York and send my fire first. Now I should have waited for like around 20 seconds because 20 seconds is the damage control on American battleships. For those people who don't know, there's like a 20 seconds immunity period for American battleships. So when you fire HE after the damage control, if your HE actually set the ship on fire within 20 seconds, it won't even set the fire anymore because the immunity zone is still up and running with the damage control, which is why my second fire didn't get started. For Japanese battleship is 5 seconds, so Americans tend to have way better damage controls than Japanese battleships. I think German battleships are 15 seconds on the Tirpitz from my experience, and that is a very important number to remember when you play battleships. Since I play a lot of battleships, I remember the exact numbers or the exact timing for it. So this New York decides to try to stall as much as he can to save his ship, and let's see if I actually get the Kraken, because I don't recall, since I haven't watched, I think this gameplay actually recorded several days ago, so I don't remember the exact score I got in this game. So I'm going to try to chase this New York down, and I think someone else is also assisting me in the process, but I think he is behind the island for my team to not be able to shoot him, so I'm the closest target. I'm going to try to get the New York here. The New York is firing HE. And here we go, 2 fire sets. That is amazing. This pretty much bags me the kill for the New York. And here we go. There you have it. Kraken Unleash. Let's check out the score. 351,000 coins, 5k XP, 143k of damage. I put myself on the top of the list with 2.2k base XP. Here's some detailed report, all the ships that do damage, mainly the battleships. You know how brutal the HE on the Myoko is against these battleships, or actually Japanese cruisers in general. I always look for battleships because they always give me the most coins and XP whenever I have the chance. And here's the coins. Aside from that, before I end this video, I got some extra stuff to talk about on the Myoko. Before I end this video, I need to point out one more really weird quirk or flaw with the Myoko, and it might deal with the game itself because I think it might be a big glitch with the Myoko. I'm not sure with the Atago. Maybe the Atago doesn't have this issue because the Atago is basically the same thing as the Myoko, since she is the one who succeeds the Myoko as a Tokayo class heavy cruiser, and also has the same turret arrangement but much better turret traverse speed and much better turret angle when it comes to firing your broadside. But with the Myoko, I'm not sure why, aside from having a very slow traverse speed that is similar to the Ioba when the turrets are the same design. Should have been similar. It should be like around 30 some seconds instead of like 38 seconds. But this dirt gun, I'm not sure why, but this dirt gun does not fire until these two guns are fully on the same side as the dirt gun. So for example, if my turrets are pointing this direction and I decided to change my turrets to the starboard side, these guns will be fully rotated, and these two guns will rotate at the same position as this gun. So these guns will be able to fire at this angle, and when this gun is fully rotated on this side, it should fire, but it does not fire, although these two guns in the back do fire. And if you play the Myoko, you will start to realize that that is an issue. And the reason why is that it won't fire until these two guns, which take longer to rotate to the other side than these guns, just due to the fact that you have to rotate more than these three guns in the back, is that these two guns must be at the same angle as this gun. So if these guns are not done rotating, even though this dirt gun has an angle where you can actually shoot the gun. It says that you can shoot it, but when you click, it doesn't shoot. It is because these two guns are not fully rotated. I'm not sure why they do that, but maybe because you have to get these two guns rotated to one side and they are under the same part of the ship. But I don't think that should be the problem here. I think the problem is really, it might be a glitch, because the Atago, if I recall correctly, Atago doesn't have this problem. It doesn't have to wait for these two front guns to rotate to fire the third gun, even though the third gun is really at an angle where it can actually fire the gun, but it's not letting it on the Myoko. With the Atago, you can actually fire the third gun. And hopefully I can get like a really short image of that happening. I'm not sure why, but it's just the way the Myoko is, and that just makes the situation worse. So the combination of having a really terrible turret angle, a very slow turret traverse speed, and of course the glitch, I think is a glitch in my opinion. That's how I feel. It doesn't make sense. Like I said, like if you can aim this gun perfectly fine, you should be able to fire, but like I said, these two guns must at least be somewhat close to fully rotating near the same angle as this third gun in order to fire the third gun. So aside from that, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time on World of Warships.